Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at Jamf. We're very excited to have you and very excited to be talking about managing certificates with Jamf. Today, I'm joined by Matthew Phillips, one of our implementation engineers, and also from our implementation engineering team, Daniel McLaughlin. My name is Cody Lewis, and I'm a field sales engineer here at Jamf. So today, we're going to be covering four main areas around certificates: high-level overviews of certificates and their use cases, as well as how to manage and deploy them inside of Jamf Pro. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my peer, Matthew Phillips. Matthew?
Hey, thanks, Cody, and thank you for hosting this webinar. I'm happy to be here. All right, let's get started. We're going to start with the most complicated topic, which is, what are certificates? Certificates, for the most part, are confusing magic voodoo that can easily complicate any conversation about device management. Their implementation and usage is easily misunderstood. Rolling out a successful cert-based project without help can be overwhelming. Also, our experience here at Jamf has shown us that certificates are often misused in a customer environment. For instance, security tells you that there's a dozen or so certs that need to be installed on the Macs. So you use Composer, pack them up, stuff that into your provisioning workflow, and done. Well, what are they for? We don't know. But they're installed in the keychain now. Are they trusted? Is the chain complete? Maybe, maybe not. This webinar seeks to try and demystify certificate creation and deployment. So, then, what is a certificate? Basically, a certificate is just a text file. That's it. Now, there's a ton more behind the scenes that goes into the signing, the cryptography, and private key infrastructure lifecycle, or PKI, that we won't go into today. We will share some links of some great deep dive videos on PKI at the end. For now, instead of getting hyper technical, we're going to do the Schoolhouse Rock version of what makes a cert. So, a cert is a text file. Here's Kurt. He's just a text file sitting here on the steps of Jamf Pro Hill, and he's gonna be a deployed cert someday. And you know what? The process is fairly straightforward. To make a cert, we need a certificate request, or CSR, and then we reach out to a certificate server who is talking to the CA, and he will add his part to the conversation, throw in a bit of love and magic, and sometimes we add the root cert as well. Then boom, we've got a digitally signed certificate. I told you that he was a text file, and that was true. But now if you open your cert in a text editor, you'll only get unreadable hex code. That's because it's encrypted. On a Mac, you can still inspect the cert contents using Spotlight by hitting spacebar, or simply open it in Keychain Access to see what's inside. What data does a certificate actually contain? Identification. A cert is essentially an ID card. A certificate is a signed and trusted form of identification, like a driver's license or passport. And like a passport, the validity of trust for the document is based on the issuing authority. If I had a forklift driver's license issued in Canada, that doesn't mean I'm authorized to operate a forklift in Germany. Similarly, a Sam's Club card doesn't get me into a Costco. So, something like a passport only works as a valid form of ID everywhere because the issuing bodies have all agreed to trust each other. If Peru says you're a citizen, America accepts that because it is a trusted document. If, for instance, I was given a galactic passport covered in sand and it claimed this person had the rank of Jedi Master, no one would believe the contents of that document because it didn't come from a trusted source. Now, let's take a look at a certificate next to a passport and see exactly how much they have in common. Here we have a passport from Peru and an Amazon certificate. We have the name or subject. In this case, the cert's common name is a wildcard for anything.jamf.com. The passport's issuing body was Peru, and in the certificate authority is Amazon. We all trust Amazon, right? Also, we have some form of unique serialization to identify the document, and of course, validity date. That is the date of issuing, as well as the expiration date. You see, certificates aren't totally incomprehensible here. In fact, the idea behind them has been around for a very, very long time. Where are certs used? Short answer, everywhere. Why do we use certificates in computing? Simply put, for security's sake. The use of trusted certificates allows for encrypted communication which can prevent information from being intercepted whilst in transit. When you visit a website using HTTPS and you get a little green check mark or a lock icon in the address bar, That's because you are communicating with that server using a certificate. The information shared with that site is secure. Certs can be used in many ways, including as an alternative to user credentials. When a client presents a certificate, the server inspects the cert and decides if it's going to trust the client based on the contents and the certificate authority that made that cert. So, where can we use this form of secure identification? First up is 802.1x Wi-Fi, commonly referred to as cert-based Wi-Fi. This is much better than traditional WPA password because the certs used cannot be shared. Typically, your network authenticator will be using EAP or Radius, depending on the encryption choices. With Jamf, we have the advantage of validating the client that is connecting to the network. The client device can present user information inside the certificate that proves exactly who is using a given device on your network. This is very useful for your friends in InfoSec. Another common use for certificates is connecting to a virtual private network. Similar to Wi-Fi, the username and password might not be enough to establish trust. We want to be able to validate the device is also trusted. Access is denied if the user credentials are disabled or if the certificate has been revoked. With this, there are more opportunities to ensure that your company data is secure. 802.1x authentication is not limited to Wi-Fi. Though less common, it can also be used on a wired network. It is another way to help prevent just anyone from plugging into a network drop and gaining access to private data. Another super cool use for certificates is encrypted email. When emails are signed and trusted, the message cannot be read without the correct certificates installed. This technology also ensures the email message has not been modified in transit after it was signed and sent. Using MDM to deploy certificates is great because Jamf maintains the certificate lifecycle, and we have various opportunities to revoke the user's access. If they fall out of compliance, yank the cert. If they leave management, well, then the certificate gets removed automatically. Taking a look at how certificates play a role in MDM with Apple specifically is APNS. Apple's entire push notification system relies on a chain of trusted certificates for communication. None of it would work without certs. In the case of Apple Configurator, we create a certificate-based supervision identity that can be shared between multiple provisioning Macs used to supervise and enroll iOS devices. This same supervision identity can be added to Jamf Pro for the devices that it supervises. And as a developer, you get involved in dozens of types of certificates, from app signing, development, distribution, and even Apple Pay certs. You're probably using some of these certificates already in Jamf. Now, when we talk about certificates in Jamf, they are also everywhere, so we need to be specific. For clarity, I'm going to go over all the places in Jamf Pro that uses certificates. Some of this may be review for you, but we feel it's important to have an understanding of which certificates you are referring to when you want to talk about certs. MDM is the big one. The enrollment profile used to add devices via MDM is signed with a certificate. Jamf Pro has its own certificate authority built in. This self-signed CA produces a root cert that must be trusted on the device before it can trust the MDM profile. Pro tip here, using automated device enrollment bypasses the need for any of this because Apple trusts Jamf. Also, we have the binary that does device management outside of MDM. This must also be trusted for it to work. Now, it happens automatically during normal enrollment. The trust JSS command shown here is usually only used when troubleshooting. SSL for your Tomcat server. The web app must be trusted to connect to it over HTTPS. Anyone who has set up a Jamf Pro server from scratch will remember this. You can trust the self-signed cert initially, but for an externally facing server, you'll need to install a publicly trusted certificate. Another pro tip, this web app stuff is all taken care of automatically with Jamf Cloud. You need not ever worry about your Tomcat settings again. The CA. I've mentioned the built-in certificate authority already. This is also where you would configure Jamf to talk to an external CA server. SCEP Proxy and ADCSC connector settings are also configured here. Our healthcare listener uses certificates to secure communication between Jamf and HCL server that lives inside the hospital network that then talks to the ADT service. If you're lucky enough to have single sign-on used in your environment, when Pro is configured to communicate with your SSO, it does so using a signing certificate. LDAP-S, or Secure LDAP, requires, you guessed it, a certificate. This one is important because claiming to be using LDAP-S does not necessarily mean you are. It has to be the correct port, 636, and include that cert. A third-party signing certificate can be used during user-initiated enrollment as opposed to the self-signed cert from earlier. And for Mac UIE, we have the option to sign the Quick Add package so the user can more easily trust and run the installer. Although slightly less important nowadays, signing the Mac enrollment package requires an app distribution certificate from Apple. This same cert is used by Composer to sign your other packages. And configuration profiles created in Jamf Pro are signed automatically. This keeps them secure when deployed. If you download a config profile directly from the console, it's already signed. That's why you can't view the raw XML data with a text editor. If you need to edit a config profile created with Jamf, you'll need to unsign it first. A provisioning profile is a different kind of profile that also uses a cert. When working with custom iOS apps, your developer might need you to deploy the app with a provisioning profile. It is less common today, but Jamf does support it. Over at developer.apple.com is where you would get that cert, among others. Here we see that Doc Brown is an Apple developer, and this is where he goes to get his signing certificates. The more common method these days is to let Xcode create and embed the distribution certificates and provisioning profiles for you automatically. Once that's done, you'll have yourself an in-house app. That's a custom iOS app that's able to be deployed using Jamf to registered test devices. If you need to deploy your custom app to hundreds of iOS devices or more, that will require an enterprise developer signing certificate. Next is the Apple deployment portals. Strictly speaking, these next few are actually tokens, which is really just a private key, and that's half of the cert conversation that we have with Apple. So, device enrollment and VPP both get their certs from Apple using the token provided. Of course, the more modern place to find that information is in Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager. And of course, we can't forget the hero of the repair world, GSX. I know Global Service Exchange has had a history of being attacked by malicious outsiders, but Apple has been good about keeping it secure, and you can choose to provide a cert to authenticate to GSX. We are in the home stretch now, folks. The Jamf Cloud distribution point, of course, uses a certificate to securely communicate between the JCDS and Jamf Cloud. But if you don't have one of those, instead you're a bit more DIY, other cloud-based delivery methods also communicate securely as well. If you like sending notifications to your devices through self-service, you'll need a push proxy certificate. They are automatically generated, so this one's easy to get set up. These next two are actually invisible to the Jamf admin, but they do communicate using certificates. They are patch management off to the Jamf patch server, and lastly are customer experience metrics, which we greatly value. Those are also sent securely to our servers. So let's jump into what I'm sure most of you are eager to see, deployment. Oh, I almost forgot. Before I do, let me explain that I put together all of those slides showing every single place that we use certificates, so I can clarify that none of those places are the certs that are being generated to install onto your devices. We do that in the payload of a configuration profile. There are a few ways to do it, and each environment is different, so there is no silver bullet here. Jamf can combine certs and Wi-Fi payloads for simplicity. And of course, this works for Mac, iOS, and even tvOS. You can also include multiple certificates into a single payload if needed. Now, when talking about user certificates and device certificates, it's important to know the context we're using. You'll hear talk of user certs and device certs or machine certs. For the most part, a user certificate contains, well, the user information in the subject, and a machine certificate contains information in the subject about the device specifically. That's how we define certificates as machine or user-based. Now, in Jamf context, when deploying a certificate, we have the option to install it at the user level or at the device level. This has absolutely nothing to do with the subject name inside the cert. Jamf doesn't look at the cert or care what's inside of it. Could be user data, could be device data. It doesn't care. What's important to know is if you choose to deploy the cert at the computer level, you are installing that certificate into the system keychain. It is available to all current and new users of that device. Now, if you deploy the certificate into the user level, then it's installed directly in that user's keychain and will not be available to any other user on that system. You can see here that it is possible to create a user cert and install it directly into the system keychain. Also, if we install a device cert into the user's space, that doesn't make it a user certificate. That's going to be a very important detail when deploying cert Wi-Fi or VPN. At this point, we want to draw attention to two Jamf product features. They are SCEP Proxy and ADCS Connector. If you are going to be deploying VPN certs or rolling out 802.1x Wi-Fi, you will likely need to use at least one of these to do it. They are similarly related but different product offerings. And these both exist as alternatives to binding your Mac to Active Directory to obtain a certificate. The benefit being that both solutions can work to produce certificates for Mac, iOS, and tvOS devices. First, let's talk about SCEP Proxy. When I say SCEP Proxy, I am not talking about System Center Endpoint Protection from Microsoft. No, it's not that thing. SCEP in our world stands for Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. In fact, in the Windows world, when you refer to SCEP, you are actually talking about NDES. That's the keyword for success when talking to other teams about SCEP. We are going to go into some demos on deploying certs. But before I do, I wanted to clear the air on one question we get often at Jamf. That is the debate, ADCSC or SCEP Proxy. Which one do we choose? And if that's what you came here for today, I'm sorry, because it's not that simple. The correct choice between the two depends on so many details, there is no single right answer. So maybe don't think of it as SCEP Proxy versus ADCS connector. Perhaps your environment, it may be a combination of both. But rest assured, we at Jamf are eager and willing to have those conversations with you to decide the best path of success for your cert-based projects. So please reach out to us immediately. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Daniel for some real-world demos. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Matthew. Now that we've seen what certificates are and how we can use them, let's look a bit more at how they're deployed. When we look at deploying our certificates to our users or devices, we have a few different methods. The first one is the most painful and unreliable method, which is the user manually requests a certificate, either by going to a web portal and filling out information, or a member of IT performing this task on behalf of the end user and then somehow getting that certificate to them. There are applications out there that can help facilitate a certificate request, tools like Nomad or Jamf Connect. These tools can take already provided information from the user and then make the certificate request on their behalf. Some challenges with this come into still requiring the user to enter some data. As well as this, these tools communicate to the certificate server directly, meaning that the request will need to occur within the network or via a VPN. These applications are also only available on macOS. Another way is for Jamf Pro to instruct the device on where to request the certificate, and the device then communicates directly with the certificate server. This means the user doesn't need to provide any information, and it can all be automated. However, the communication will be between the device and the certificate server, which will likely mean the device needs to be on the same network as the certificate server. And finally, what's becoming the most commonly used method is for Jamf Pro to act as a proxy between the device and the certificate server. This would be by using either SCEP Proxy or Jamf's ADCS connector. This provides the benefits of the previous method, where the certificate request can be done silently and in an automated fashion. But an added benefit of this is that the communication flow changes so that the device only needs to be able to contact the Jamf Pro server, so that the device could be on any internet connection and still be able to get the required certificates. Let's have a look at what that communication is like for those last two methods. So here's what we mean by direct certificate request method. We have our certificate server, our Jamf Pro server, in this case Jamf Cloud, and our devices. Let's say that our devices and certificate server are on the same network. With this method, the device first must talk to Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro will then instruct the device where the certificate server is located and what the device needs to provide in order to request a certificate. Then the device will contact the certificate server, and the certificate server responds with a certificate. But what happens when you have devices outside the network, and then they try to contact the certificate server for their certificate? It's very unlikely the network and security team will allow this communication from outside the internal network. This is where Jamf Pro has helped organizations deploying certificates to both internal and remote devices without compromising security or having certificate servers accessible over the internet. We still have the same players as before: our certificate server, still within the internal network, and our Jamf Pro server. This time, let's assume all of our devices are outside the network. With Jamf Pro, it can act as an intermediary for requesting certificates so that devices only need to talk to Jamf Pro, and Jamf Pro is the only thing then talking to the certificate server. Let's see what that communication looks like. The devices contact Jamf Pro then contacts the certificate server then responds back to Jamf Pro with the certificate, and then Jamf Pro deploys the certificate to the device. Here is a recorded demonstration of that communication. In this example, I am using Jamf Cloud, and the Mac is running macOS Big Sur 11.1. However, this method will also work for any Apple device, be it iPhone, iPad, or even an Apple TV. On the left-hand side in the Jamf Pro console, we have a certificate payload configured and populated with Jamf's profile variables. These variables are going to see that the device is assigned to me, and as such, the certificate is going to be my full name. Alternate profile variables could be used for a device-based certificate instead, depending on your organization's requirements. On the right-hand side, we can see the keychain access application that currently isn't showing any user certificates present. There is one certificate present, however, which is the device enrollment certificate from Jamf Pro. To speed up this demonstration, as I mentioned, I've already gone ahead and enrolled this device into Jamf Pro, and the profile is going to be using Jamf's ADCS connector for the communication, which has already been configured. However, it would be the same experience if using SCEP proxy instead of the ADCS connector. The video has also not been sped up in any way. So we can see the contents of the request, my profile variables for full name and email address, and I'll go to the Scope tab, I'll click on Add, search for my device, and there it is, Daniel's MacBook Air. I'll click Add, and then Save. From this point, Jamf Pro will now be communicating to the certificate server. The server will then respond with a certificate for Daniel McLaughlin, and then Jamf Pro will deploy it to the device. And there we see it appearing on the right in the keychain. And there we are, a certificate with my full name deployed using Jamf's ADCS connector. You may have noticed briefly that the certificate is marked as untrusted. While this might appear as a big scary message, it doesn't mean that this certificate is invalid, and it can be used as an authentication method for Wi-Fi or VPN. What it is referring to is that the macOS device doesn't know where the certificate server came from. In order to remove this message, you would look at deploying the root certificate of the server in order to establish what is called a trust chain. I would also like to point out that this device was not bound to Active Directory or any other directory service, and it was on a guest network that had no direct communication to the certificate server. Instead, it was only talking to Jamf Pro, and then Jamf Pro then made the certificate request before deploying it to the device. So this all sounds great, and the methods of deploying the cert will vary depending on your organization. So then we get the question of, what do we need to do to get this working? Often this comes up as an infrastructure type discussion, and it really comes down to your organization as well as what you wish to accomplish with the certificates once deployed. As such, we won't be going into too much detail in this webinar, but I would encourage you to reach out to your Jamf representative, and if you don't have a Jamf representative, there will be contact options available at the end of the webinar. From there, we can have an offline discussion with you about how Jamf can help you succeed in deploying certificates to your devices within your organization. But the requirements from an Apple device side are quite minimal. A supported version of the OS on the device, a supported certificate authority such as Microsoft CA, DigiCert, Entrust, or Venafi, to name a few. But the biggest requirement for you as an Apple admin in wanting to achieve a successful deployment of certificates to your devices with Jamf is the cooperation of other teams within your organization, such as the networking team, security team, and some organizations even have a dedicated certificate team. We at Jamf can help you work with those team members as well, engaging with these different departments and providing context on what is required from each department in order to have a successful deployment. Since we have the certificate, you might still be thinking, how do we use it? Here we have an example of how an end user can manually select the certificate and use as an authentication to the corporate wireless network. On the right, we can still see the certificate that was deployed from the previous video, and on the left, I've selected an 802.1x enterprise network. Within the mode, I change the drop-down to EAP TLS. I will then have the option to select a certificate from the keychain. This of course can be automated by including the network settings payload within the configuration profile that contains the certificate payload. Similarly with VPN, we can also see here the similar options with a VPN connection providing that type of VPN supports certificates as a method of authentication. Again, this would be something that you would need to work with the respective teams within your organization. And like with the network options, this too can be automated with configuration profiles where you have a VPN payload and the certificate payload within the one profile. So, what did we learn? Well, I hope we learned a bit more about certificates, and that certificates, while a complicated topic, can be used in a few different ways, and maybe aren't as difficult as you once thought. There will be some resource links at the end of this presentation, and in addition to those, the Apple admin community on Jamf Nation also has had long discussions about variations of this topic. And of course, we encourage you to reach out to us so that we can work with you and the respective teams in deploying certificates within your environment. And with that, I'll hand it back to Cody.
Thanks, Daniel. And thank you everyone for joining. We're very Happy that you were able to be here today and join us for talking about certificates and understanding some better ways to manage them inside of Jamf Pro. We hope that something stuck and you were able to take something away from today's session. We also have here on the screen some more resources. So if maybe some of your questions weren't answered, hopefully you'll find those answers in one of the resources here listed. Feel free to jot these down, but remember we will be sending out a copy of this afterwards. And if you have more questions, maybe more specific to your environment or your infrastructure, feel free to reach out to us here at Jamf. We're happy to schedule some time and the appropriate resources to talk to you about getting this implemented in the correct manner inside of your organization.